Early years, I grew up just me and my mom. She worked as a waitress at the hot shops in Washington, D.C. I went to school, Greenbelt Junior High in Greenbelt, Maryland, which is right outside of College Park, right off the Beltway. And then I went to Bladensburg High School, which is right next to Washington, D.C. And 11th grade, I quit and went into the Marine Corps. Other veterans I'd seen on Memorial Days and stuff, you would go to parades they'd put on, and I noticed, I used to think to myself, these older men that I seen as heroes would be crying, and I couldn't understand why these guys were that tough and tears were coming from their eyes, because they'd lost all their fellow Marines, and I'd talked to some before. Of course, Marine Corps uniform is, Marines is a small unit, combat unit. Used first to strike. You usually send them in first. So, but I've always wanted to go to Marine Corps. I want to see, when you're young, you think you're bulletproof and you're tough as a nail. So you want to see how tough it is. Boot camp, well, they fly you down, then they stick you on a bus at night. And you've probably been up a day or two before you get to boot camp. And you arrive there at night on a bus. And the drill instructors, now this is 1967, they come to meet you on the bus at night. And I can't really repeat what they say when they get on the bus, but the last person on this bus better be the first one off. They march you into a place called receiving after they take everything you own, stick you at attention. Your eyes are straight ahead, your thumbs are at your side, the seams, and you stand there. We stood there for 2 days at attention. Guys were falling over on the floor, and they would throw ammonia onto their nose to get them back up. Now, a lot of times in receiving, after 1 day, they pick you up, but my unit, it took 2 days for them to get us. So we're going without sleep probably for 3 days as soon as we got there. And you're in total shock. Because if you ever seen the movie Full Metal Jacket, that's how exactly, that was a real drill instructor, and it was like that, but worse. And my drill instructor, I found out years later, actually was presented the Congressional Medal of Honor. His name was McKinney. And I found it out years later. And he was in the same area a couple years before, and where I ended up being in Vietnam. So, and then I went to infantry training school. There was no break whatsoever. You leave Paris Island, you go to infantry training school at Camp Lejeune. You go through that, then you get like a 30-day break, you can go home. Then I went to guerrilla warfare school at Camp Pendleton. I left there and took off, went to Okinawa, from Okinawa to Vietnam. If I remember the month I went in the Marines, it was probably around April. I ended up in Vietnam of October '67. It was actually, I think it was an American airline jet that flew us into Da Nang, and it was at night. So, and you don't know anybody because you don't know these other Marines or who you're with because you didn't travel as a unit. There were a whole mess of units that you traveled with. I believe the Army, they always traveled with their units, but the Marines didn't. So you didn't know anybody you were with. And we were at Da Nang for like maybe 2 days. So the scuttlebutt was you don't want to go with the 4th Marines or the 9th Marines because that's where all the combat's at. And a guy come out and said, if you're going with the 4th or 9th Marines, you better sharpen up your E-tools. And we thought that meant digging a hole. It meant hand-to-hand combat with entrenching tools. So there was a boy with me from Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. So I thought, well, let's go see what this is about and what we can get into in the roughest situation. So he said, sounds good to me. So we went with the 4th Marines. We ended up at a place called Camp Evans. We were on a convoy. And of course, you don't know where you're at all, and this is during the daytime. And we reported in there, and it was getting dark then too. So the only person I was with that I knew is the boy from Pennsylvania. The rest of these guys, we don't know. There's probably maybe 20 of us. And we arrive at this camp called Camp Evans. It was starting to get dark, and we're all kind of a little bit rowdy, and because we've been through boot camp and all this, and we're thinking, well, what can they do to us? Because we're in Vietnam, the only worst thing that can happen is we're going to get killed. Well, this first sergeant comes out, who, by the way, ends up being 9th Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, running the whole Marine Corps, but at the time we didn't know any of this. But he was the first sergeant, been in Korea, chosen reservoir with Chesley Puller. So this guy's like 6'6", cigar in his mouth, looks like he's made out of steel. And we're still running our mouths out there. He comes out and calls attention. We don't listen. So you're standing in formation. In the Marines, you stand from the tallest to the shortest, because I'm the shortest. He's standing up front, everybody's still running their mouth, calls attention again, keeps running their mouth, everybody keeps talking. He takes the butt of this pump shotgun and busts this guy in the face as hard as he can, and he drops to the ground. And we're going like, oh my God, I don't know who this guy is, but he's dangerous and he ain't kidding around. So about then, they start assigning you to each platoon, weapons platoon. You got 3 platoons, 1st platoon, 2nd platoon, 3rd platoon, and weapons platoon. So they assign you to these different platoons. So they wanted volunteers. The mortar team, the 60 mortar team, had a lot of these guys had been killed, so they wanted volunteers for 60 mortars, which I didn't know what a 60 mortar was at the time. So I volunteered for that, and my buddy from Pennsylvania volunteered for it. But they didn't have a 60 mortar because the 60 mortar team had been all killed. So they just put as riflemen, which we were anyhow. That's really what we were. When you're in the Marines and you're an 0311, you become anything. When somebody gets killed, machine gunner, 60 mortarman, M79 man, to take their place, you become that. So it doesn't really matter. 0311 is the basic MOS that we have, and that's Special Land Enforcement. That's what we are, all weapons. But I ended up in weapons platoon. So the sergeant comes out and gets us to take us to this tent. It's actually a bunch of sandbags, a little bit of canvas over it. And the first thing he says to us, he says, oh, I see you met our first sergeant. And everybody's going like, oh, yeah. And he says, you need to stay away from him. So we did. So we spent the night there at Camp Evans. The next day we're going out into combat. So we'd only been there 2 days. Well, not including arriving at Da Nang. But from where we're at now at Camp Evans, we've only been there 2 days. So we're going out in the mountains on patrol in the jungle. And nobody knows anything. We haven't been in any combat whatsoever. We're going up an old creek bed, and we get ambushed. And about the first 5 guys get killed. And this is like, we realized then, this is not television and this is no game. Guys are bleeding to death. Shot in the leg where you see a cowboy movie and you think, okay, they're in the leg. Hits that main artery, goes back up behind the growing. They can't pinch it off. He bleeds to death in like 2 minutes. So I lay down a field of fire trying to protect these guys while the corpsman gets in there. So it's a big blow up. Nobody knows what's going on. They have to call a medevac in to get these other guys out. That night we set a perimeter up, the 360. And of course, like I said, we don't know what's going on because we just got there. The hole beside me, you get your E-tool, you dig a hole, you get down in your hole. And you're in the middle of the jungle. You don't know what's going on. These guys have just been killed. And I didn't know what was going on. They came to us 2 days later and says, did anybody know any of these guys? They didn't even know their names because we just got there. I'm sure they found them out later, but they didn't even know who they were. But anyhow, we dig our holes, we get in our holes. We haven't been dug in, but I don't know, an hour or two, we hear this gigantic explosion beside us. the hole beside us. There's 3 guys in a hole. We don't know what had happened because it's night. You can't get out of the hole, run around, because you could get shot by one of your own guys, so you stay put. Well, what had happened, we found out the next morning, is they were digging their hole, and they were carrying their grenades wrong. When they bent over, the grenade fell out. They hit it with their entrenching tool and kills all 3 of them. So now they're all 3 dead. And I've just been there 2 days. There's probably 10 guys dead and wounded, and I'm thinking, this didn't go in too good. I don't know how long, you're going to be here for 13 months and this is going on. So after this, next day we go up a little bit further and we run into another ambush, but guys were wounded, but they wasn't killed, and then we killed a few North Vietnamese too. So then we pull back, and I thought I was in great shape, and we're back in the mountains. I don't know, I probably weighed 125, and I'm probably carrying 80 to 90 pounds of gear on me. And then we come back, from the time you get up, we're going back to Camp Evans. So we marched from probably daybreak till dark to get back to Camp Evans with no breaks. And we get back to Camp Evans and we rest for like a day. So then they come to us and said, we're going up north, up on the DMZ, up to Con Tien, which is the furthest base north. If you went any further in Con Tien, you'd be in North Vietnam. And it's actually called the Hill of Angels. So we go up, we get on a convoy, we go through Hue, which Hue blew up during the Tet Offensive, but we go through there before it ever blew up on the Tet Offensive. We go up through Hue, we go to Dung Ha. So we get to Dung Ha, and it's at night there too. Don't know where you're at, don't know what's going on. It's a huge perimeter. They can land aircraft there and everything. But it's the Marine Corps 3rd Marine Division main base. So you got your C rations in there, and we're not on the perimeter, we're inside the perimeter because we just got there, and these other guys are guarding the perimeter. So you have C rations. What you eat is what was packed in 1942 to 45, 12 different kinds, and that's all we had. So they actually put one of us guarding our C rations to keep the other Marines from stealing them. So you take like 3-hour watches and then you jump on top of these C rations. So I jumped on top of the C rations. I was about the 2nd watch. So I climbed up on top. I fell asleep. Wrong thing to do. Of all people that comes by from wherever he's coming from, and I realize I hear this voice, who's on guard here? And I jumped down and said, I am, sir. The sandbags are around the tents, about 4 feet high. I get knocked over into the tent, down in between the sandbags, and I'm going like, who in the heck is this? So I get back up to go confront him. I get knocked back down again. So I get back up again. I said, I don't know if I want to go see this guy again or not. Well, it wakes up everybody in the hooch in the tent. It's the 1st sergeant, the one that would kill you if you fell asleep on his lines. And his name's, he ended up being Sergeant Major Crawford, the top sergeant of the United States Marine Corps, but he was the 1st sergeant then. So after that little episode, and it wasn't dangerous for me to fall asleep because I was guarded from the Marines, from our guys stealing it, but he didn't take anything from anybody. And the next day we go out in the bush, and we stayed in the bush pretty much after this because we're a search and destroy unit. Our job was to go find the North Vietnamese, kill them all, or we get killed too in the process. But he'd been in Korea, and if it wasn't for him, we'd have got probably our whole unit would have been killed because this guy knows what he's doing. Even though he's a real badass, he knows what's going on. When we'd set up a perimeter, if you fell asleep on his lines, you didn't get office hours, you got shot. Because if you fell asleep on that perimeter and those North Vietnamese came through in the perimeter, they'd slit your throat or jump in the holes with you. They called them sappers. They were suicide squads. With their satchel charges on their side, they'd jump in the hole with you and blow themselves up and you too, plus kill as many Marines as they could do. So you fell asleep on his line, you weren't going to wake up the next morning. So nobody fell asleep. But like I said, we were a search and destroy unit. We stayed in the bush on the DMZ from Con Tien to Khe Sanh and back, fighting North Vietnamese, and captured 2 Russians that wasn't supposed to be there. And the joke was when they captured the 2 Russians, because they were running around with the red Chinese that wasn't supposed to be there. And we were kind of, because we couldn't get water and sea rations a lot of the times. Going without food we could go with for 4 or 5 days and not get any choppers coming in to bring us our sea rations in. Food, we'd go back to trash pits and dig up old crackers and ants and stuff and eat them because we didn't have any food. But the one thing you're not going to go without is water. And when it's 120 degrees out, you're humping 80 pounds of gear. What we would do is get up before daybreak, try to make contact with the enemy. If we did or not, we'd set another perimeter up that night, and we'd keep moving all the time. So, like I said, a lot of times they'd say there were streams out there, and there wasn't. They were all dried up. And it got so bad that we would have to take our utility jackets and wipe the water off the leaves to wet our mouths because our lips were cracking, and you lose the saliva in your mouth. Believe me, nowadays, when I'm brushing my teeth, I turn the water off because I remember how bad that was, going without water. But like I said, we just moved for 13 months constantly from Con Tien, Camp Carroll, the Rock Pile, LZ Vandergrift, Khe Sanh, and I left from Hill 950 at Khe Sanh when I left there 13 months later. In 1968, a general came out. This was in probably around June, and we'd been in a lot of combat. I mean, a lot of guy boys have been killed. I'd seen a lot, so I'm thinking, well, it can't get a whole lot worse. We're one of these LZs, and you don't ever see a general in the field. The highest ranking guy you might see is a full-bird colonel or major. So in 1968, well, I was at Con Tien, my lieutenant, and I read an article about him, put it in a paper. But he was a 1st Platoon lieutenant, got killed. Weapons platoon, his name was Donald W. Pratt. He was weapons platoon lieutenant. He had to take the place of the 1st Platoon lieutenant because 1st Platoon lieutenant had been killed. Well, him and I became friends, and I'd always talk to him even though he wasn't in weapons platoon anymore. And who took over the weapons platoon? The 1st Sergeant Crawford. So I really didn't have any officers in charge of me, but they were always telling you where you're going, who you're going with and stuff. They'd come to me and say, John Wayne, you're going with so-and-so. I'd tell them, well, you have to go see 1st Sergeant Crawford and ask him. End of conversation. So I pretty much could go with any platoon I wanted to. But Pratt and that 1st Platoon came past me, and they were going on a perimeter check at Con Tien. And he says, come on and go with us. I said, I can't go because they keep blowing my bunker up with artillery, and I got to fill sandbags. So I didn't go. He goes out that day, gets killed. Him and 26 other Marines got killed that day. That's just one day. When you went out, you knew somebody wasn't coming back, but you didn't know who it was going to be. But that was a huge amount of guys that get killed in one day. But like I said, you knew wasn't going to make it. Every time you went out, you knew pretty much somebody's not coming back. You become numb. I tell you, Crawford, the 1st Sergeant, he actually put me in charge of setting up LZs and getting our dead and wounded out. And I was supposed to trade off with other Marines. Now, I'm going to tell you, some of these guys are the baddest asses I've ever seen in my life. I mean, they would literally charge the enemy. But of all things, they did not want to touch our dead. And I know why, because I didn't either, but I started doing it. And it becomes like a switch goes off in you. You become numb. So what you try to do is help your guys and then have to get other guys to help me to carry the wounded dead, set up at the landing zone to get them out as soon as possible. So I was supposed to stop doing it and get another Marine to do it. And you could tell when you talk to him, it's like, please don't make me do this. So I just kind of kept doing it the whole time. But you become like a zombie. You have no feelings. And when we went 1968, General Davis, I found this out later because Randy Brinkley, who was Colonel Brinkley, moved here too. And he was the one that ran Top Gun School, but he was Special Landing Force in Vietnam. So I find out 40, 50 years later that this general is out there, and I can remember word for word what he said. He said, we've got permission from the Commander-in-Chief, which is the President of the United States, to be the first unit into the militarized zone, because prior to that, you wasn't allowed in there. He said there's a North Vietnamese battalion caught, and they can't get back across the Ben Ha River. And he said, tomorrow, before the dust from the B-52s have hit the ground, we're going in like fighting like Marines, and we're going to die like Marines, and we're not coming back till all of them are dead or all us are dead. And I'd been there probably about 10 months then and seen quite a bit, and I'm going like, boy, this don't sound too good. Choppers pick us up the next morning. We get on choppers, and we're up for a while. When you're up for a while, you know that something's going on. It's like a hot LZ, which means they're there. We land, and we hit their perimeter. After we get out of our chopper stuff, we hit their perimeter. There was probably, I don't know, 5, 10 Marines killed out of my battalion, and then wounded. But we ran all these North Vietnamese out of their holes. So we killed quite a few of them. We took over their holes. So we're out there for about an hour, and we're setting up interlocking fire, which is machine guns, mortars. You interlock all your fires so there's no route they can get to you. So we set all that up, and I'm standing there trying to set up a 60 mortar, and the 81 mortar guy comes over to me, which is a bigger mortar, and wants to know where I'm hitting, so he'll hit a different place to cover everything. About then, we hear these bugles blowing, and we're going like, and we'd already had a platoon out checking outside our perimeter. Well, they come right past me. The radio man was killed, and a couple other guys were killed. They brought them back in. But the bugles started blowing, and then the mortars and stuff started raining on top of us. So then you got to get your heads down. Then they started hitting us from all sides. So now, being, just a Lance Corporal, you don't know what's really going on. And the choppers were coming in, and the first sergeant was beside me, who ended up running home Marine Corps. And we fought for 2 days straight, laying them out, and then they got quite a few of us too. But when you set that perimeter up with 300 guys, you can't see the other side of the perimeter. I was Alpha Company, the other side of the perimeter was Delta Company. After the second day, and they said, make every round count. You're getting no help. The forward air guy, which spotter planes fly around for the F-4s to drop 500-pound bombs and artillery, they were in on top of us so close we couldn't use artillery or aircraft anymore because they would have blown us up along with them. But after the second day, Crawford yells to everybody, make every round count. Nobody's coming to help us, and we're surrounded. So I find out, this is funny it's kind of funny, but from Colonel, let me think for a minute, Brinkley, from Colonel Brinkley, who ends up running Top Gun School. I find out they didn't drop us in an NVA battalion, which is 300. They dropped us as a reinforced division. You're almost talking 2,000 that surrounded us. So Crawford,
and how many did you have?
300. What was left of 300, because we were shot up pretty bad. But he said, nobody's coming to help us. It's fight to the death. So here comes this helicopter in at the last minute. And I said, well, he's full of crap. Here comes a chopper bringing Marines in. Well, about that time, an RPG hits the chopper and blows the whole tail section off of it. And it flips around and crashes. and it looks like a big praying mantis sitting there. It's dead. But anyhow, after the second day, I see these other Marines behind me. I said, well, here come some more Marines, man. And they said, you don't get it. That's all that's left of Delta Company. Everybody's been shot and killed from the captain on down to a corporal. Pushed us back across the LZ, so you can forget about anything coming in. And I didn't realize how bad it was until, like I said, 50 years later. There was probably about 25 of us that still capable of fighting out of 300. But on the third day, we loaded bodies for hours and hours and wounded. Not all were killed and wounded. But there was only about 25 still capable of fighting. And the funny part of this is 50 years later, I find out that Crawford ends up being 9th Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, running the whole Marine Corps, because they didn't know what happened to me. Then I find out that my major ends up being Major General Hopkins, who led the invasion into Kuwait. So after I found out about Crawford being at headquarters Marine Corps, I found out he actually really liked me. So then he says, I call him at headquarters Marine Corps, and he says, I want you to call General Hopkins and tell him you made it, you're still alive. Now, he's in San Diego, and I call him, and now these guys are career Marines. They've been in for 30 years, and I'm going like, oh, there's no way this guy's going to remember me, you know. But we were getting the dead and wounded out, and there was a guy in with the dead, and we carried him in ponchos, not body bags. And I seen this smoke coming out of this poncho, and I was going like, what's this about? Because these guys are all dead, and the smoke's coming out. So I go over there and pull this poncho back. There's a Marine in there with his hand blown off, and somebody had lit him a cigarette. So then his intestines are coming out. So I take my jacket, put some water on it, put it on his side, and he says to me, he says, this will be my third Purple Heart. I'm getting out of here. And I'm going like, you got to be kidding me. So this guy's calling these choppers in. I don't know who this guy is. So I said, hey, you dumb SOB, get that chopper back here. You left a wounded and with the dead. So the guy calls the chopper back, and we got him out of there. I find out 50 years later, it's Major General Hopkins, and I didn't call him. I called him a few names back. And the way he remembered me, he said, you're that little son of a bitch with a big mouth. And I said, yeah, that's me. So that's how he remembered me getting them choppers back there.
Wow.
And then after that mess was over, we still stayed in the bush. After we went back and regrouped, we got more Marines and went out and still stayed search and destroy. And I ended up at Quezon and last part of October and November, first part of November '68. And I'd been in the bush so long, the Graves registration guy who works in the rear to register all the dead and wounded in and stuff, he had a high college education so he could type. But he had 2 kids, and he was older than us. So 6 months before, I went to the first sergeant and said, look, you need to get him out of here. He's got children, and most of us were all single. I said, you need to get Lindsay out of here. If he gets killed, he's got 2 children. So he goes back to the rear, and he becomes great. So I don't see him for like 6 months. He comes out to Quezon to see the captain, gets off the chopper, looks over at me and said, what are you doing out here? And I'm going like, well, what do you mean, Larry? He said, you were supposed to be out of the field 20 days ago. Your plane leaves tomorrow to go back to the United States. I'm going like, you got to be kidding me. So I always kid these other guys. It was Quezon. I said, if he wouldn't have come out there, I'd still be running around Quezon somewhere. So I jumped on a chopper and came on back home. I never realized how lucky we are to live in this country. And a lot of those people lived in, we didn't see very many civilians, but they were, the ones we did see were living in cardboard boxes from our old sea rations and stuff. But I was never around hardly any civilians at all. We were fighting North Vietnamese regular, few Chinese, couple Russians. But then when I brought my rifle with me, and I didn't carry that rifle with me because you're carrying so much gear, you can't carry that stuff. We blew up thousands of AK-47s, Russian weapons in the DMZ. It just blew them all to pieces. But this one rifle I sent back to one of the guys that was going to rear, and I carved my name in the stock so I could get it when I got back to the rear, and it was still there. So I've got the paperwork for it. And then when we got to Okinawa, they took our rifles from us because some of the Marines had kind of lost it. They were up in the mountains shooting out taxi cab taillights and headlights, and they wouldn't let Marines in the airport. We had to sit outside because these guys were just going nuts. And then when I got to California, which is El Toro, and you leave from LA airport, well, I just marched in the airport with this rifle. Now, this is 1968, and put it up on the counter, and the lady said, well, you can't take that on a plane. And you got to realize, back then, Marines were like state police or whatever. We're here to protect you, not to do anything else. But she said, you can't take that on a plane. I said, look, if I got to walk this back across the United States to D.C., I'll walk it. Just so happens the pilot of the plane I was getting on overheard me. He said, you just get back from Vietnam? I said, yeah. He said, what's up? And I said, they won't let me take the rifle on a plane. He said, you give it to me and I'll put it in the cockpit. And when we get to D.C., I'll give it back to you. So we went to St. Louis, and then went from St. Louis to Washington, D.C., which was National Airport then. But of all things, we're coming in late in the evening, and all the lights are on. Now, I grew up in that area and never seen anything from high, and I used to run around the Smithsonian and all that when we were kids. But to appreciate this country, you could see that all lit up from the air. I was going like, how great is this? So we land, the pilot comes out, gives me my rifle. I just walked through National Airport with my rifle. Nobody says anything or does anything. And my mom picked me up with my girlfriend in National Airport. Took me back. I was home one day, been gone for 15 months. Tickled to death to get home. I've got malaria. And I had it in Vietnam and it came back. I ended up at Andrews Air Force Base in the hospital there for almost a month. Back then they'd pack you in ice and strap you down and put intravenous in your arms. And of course I was like the only Marine in the Air Force. They wanted to get rid of me as soon as possible because I wouldn't listen to anything they had to say. I'll tell you a quick funny story. The Air Force, they lived better than we did at Camp Lejeune in Vietnam. So they got these little candy-striped girls running around, and they want you to go to the bathroom in the rack. And I'm going like, I ain't doing this. So back then they had the intravenous with those glass bottles. Well, so my bright idea is I'll just take this bottle with me and go to the bathroom. So I go in there. What I don't realize is the thing's empty. I put it on the floor, and all my blood drains back out, and I pass out on the hopper. Of course, they come in and find me. About then, they were ready to strap me in a rack so I can't get out. But the Marine Corps would throw you out of the hospital, and the Air Force won't let you go. But I finally stayed there, I don't know, maybe 3-4 weeks till they let me out. Then my leave started back up. So then I run into another great situation. I'm home for like 30 days. I'm going back to Camp Lejeune. I get back to Camp Lejeune, and the MPs are waiting there for me. I report to Special Landing Force down there too. And I'm going like, they said, you're UA for 30 days. You're going to the brig. And I'm going like, you have to be kidding me. They never called from Andrews, and they were supposed to, down to Lejeune to tell them I was in the hospital. But they figured it all out, and it got straightened out. And then I went out to Geiger. I became a weapons instructor, teaching every weapon the Marine Corps had. Then after that, I'm with Fleet Marine Force 36 Marines. I go train with NATO forces with the Brits all over Europe. And then come back and go back to teaching weapons down at Camp Lejeune. Well, you kind of stay in touch with guys, especially the ones that was in a lot of combat and stuff. My buddy ended up being one of the head guys on the Delaware State Police, and I'd visit him because I was in Maryland. I'd go visit him all the time. And William H. Rohr, who makes Maalox, they had a plant right on the Delaware Bay where the ocean comes in, take magnesium. I went to work for them for 24 years. There's 5 guys here in the county, 26 Marines, 4th Marine, 9th Marine, 3rd Force Recon. We all hang around together and we help each other. And not only that, one of my other promises was I would help other veterans and everything, which I've been doing for 50 years or whatever. I mean, World War II guys, taking them to the hospital. One of them was with Patton, lived up Cove Creek. The other one was with, lived in Butler. He was on Guadalcanal. Bernie and Burl Cowan lived right up the road here. He was on Saipan and took care of, they died within 4 hours of each other as a nurse, 70 years married. About 2 months ago, his daughter calls me and said, I've got something my dad wants you to have. And I said, what's that? And he said, his Purple Heart and his battle ribbons from Saipan. So I've got it all mounted on my wall down there. And I never got a scratch. All my buddies, I've got 16 guys down there who've been presented every medal but the Congressional. And my cousin was killed when he was 19. He won the Navy Cross. But everybody's Bronze Stars, Silver Stars, as many as 3 Purple Hearts. So I had 5 of them here last year. And they presented me a phony Purple Heart because I never got hit. And I tell everybody I was short. They just missed me. Another story, I go to Pennsylvania, go to Penn State, and I knew he was from Harrisburg, but I'd lost track of him for like 20 years. And I know his name, Joe Evans, so I get in the phone book and start looking up Evans. Get him on the first phone call. His wife answers the phone, I tell him who I am, and I'm thinking, well, I hope his life became a lot better than mine, drinking and all that stuff. And she said, we've been looking for you for 20 years, because I'd moved from Maryland to Delaware, North Carolina. And she said, it's not been very good. We don't know who this person is anymore. He'd been living in a junkyard drunk for 20 years. And he said, you can't go back there because he'll shoot whoever comes back there. So I said, tell him I'll be getting up with him soon. So I'm in State College, and I go over to Harrisburg and meet with him. And back then, the VA was so screwed up, it's unbelievable. He was hit with me, and they operated on him, and it looked like they took a chainsaw to him to get shrapnel out of him. They were trying to take his home away from him. Now, this post-traumatic stress, nobody knew anything about this. I mean, that was unheard of. First time I ever seen it was in a newspaper. But anyhow, I finally got him to quit drinking, and the VA was trying to take his house from him, and called a few congressmen and senators. We got him $200,000 back pay, got him sober. So I found him, and that's the boy who was with me the whole time. And then to see what had happened, though, the sergeant major and them had passed away. So but I still have all that in writing. I said, whatever pertains to me pertains to him, because he was right there with me. So he ended up getting straight, and as far as I know now, everything's fine. I can't fix what had happened. For a long time, I thought it was my fault that these guys were dead. I actually thought I should go around and apologize to their parents because I couldn't fix it. And one of the doctors, Ann Stanton, a lady I seen, she said, who do you think you are? And I said, what do you mean? She said, you're not Jesus Christ. You can't bring these guys back from the dead. And a light bulb went off, and I was going like, she's right. I'm not. But it's a heavy burden to carry for so many years until you finally give it to Jesus Christ. It's his, it's not mine. And that's how I dealt with it. So now I just try to help other guys. They had some guys from Afghanistan. There's a bear club down the road here, and John Vorst, the one in 3rd Force Recon that might show up here, him and I went down and talked to these boys that was having a lot of trouble with post-traumatic stress, and I knew what they were going to say because they sent them to these shrinks that read books. But if you haven't been there and done that, you can't comprehend it. And you can't expect them to. But we talked to them for a couple of hours, and they told us, which makes you feel good, we've learned more from you in 2 hours than we've learned in 2 years from going to the VA. Because you know what they're doing, you know what they're going through, and they're not fooling me. I've been there, done that. Now I'm proud of the Marine Corps. I'm proud of what I did in Vietnam.
Should be.
And I'm proud of this country. And I will always fly the red, white, and blue to the day I die.